Margaret Chen had always been a light sleeper, but nothing could have prepared her for the sound that would shatter her peaceful nights in Millbrook, Vermont. It began on a Tuesday in late October, when the autumn wind carried more than just the scent of dying leaves through her bedroom window. At exactly 12:03 a.m., according to the glowing digits on her nightstand clock, a sound pierced the darkness, a crying so profound, so filled with anguish, that it seemed to come from the very depths of human despair. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The crying wasn't the wailing of a baby or the sobbing of a child. This was something else entirely, a keening that spoke of loss so complete it made her bones ache with sympathy. Margaret pressed her ear to the cool glass of her bedroom window, trying to determine its source. The sound seemed to drift from the direction of Hollow Creek, the small waterway that meandered behind the row of modest houses on Maple Street. Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from today in the comments below. If you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and moments of justice, please consider subscribing. Margaret had moved to Millbrook 6 months earlier, seeking the quiet retirement she'd earned after 35 years as a pediatric nurse in Boston. The small Vermont town, with its population of barely 3,000, had seemed like the perfect place to write her memoirs and tend to the garden she'd always dreamed of cultivating. Her neighbors were friendly but respectful of boundaries, exactly what she'd hoped for. The Hendersons to her left were a retired couple who spent their days antiquing and their evenings watching old movies. To her right lived James Morrison, a widower in his 70s who maintained an impressive vegetable garden and always had fresh tomatoes to share. The crying continued for nearly 20 minutes that first night, rising and falling like a lament carried on the wind. Margaret found herself drawn to her window, watching the shadows dance across her backyard under the pale moonlight. The sound was hypnotic in its grief, and she felt an unexpected pull of recognition, as if some deep part of her understood the pain being expressed in that wordless song. When silence finally returned to Maple Street, Margaret remained at her window for another hour, waiting. But the night offered nothing more than the usual symphony of crickets and the distant hum of the interstate. She eventually returned to bed, but sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the echo of that mournful crying, and she found herself wondering about its source. Was someone in distress? Should she have called the police? The next morning brought crisp October sunshine, and the rational explanations that daylight often provides. Over coffee and toast, Margaret convinced herself that she'd probably heard an animal, perhaps a fox or a cat in distress. The rural setting was new to her, and she was still learning the sounds of country life. She'd grown accustomed to the urban cacophony of Boston, where sirens and traffic created a constant white noise. Here in Millbrook, every sound seemed amplified by the silence. She mentioned the incident casually to James Morrison when he stopped by with a basket of late-season squash from his garden. James was a tall, weathered man, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and Margaret had come to value his practical wisdom and knowledge of local history. "Crying, you said?" James paused in his arrangement of the butternut squash on her kitchen counter, his expression shifting from neighborly concern to something more guarded. "What time was this?" "Just after midnight," Margaret replied, studying his face. "Why? Have you heard it too?" James was quiet for a long moment, his gnarled hand still resting on a particularly large squash. When he looked up, Margaret saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Fear. "Margaret," he said slowly, "how much do you know about the history of this area? About Hollow Creek?" The question sent an unexpected chill down her spine. "Just what the realtor told me. It's a historic area, settled in the 1800s. "Why?" James glanced toward her back window, where the creek was visible as a silver thread through the trees. "There are some stories," he said carefully. "Old stories. Most folks don't talk about them much anymore, but—" He trailed off, seeming to wrestle with himself. "But what, James?" He met her eyes again, and she saw the weight of years in his gaze. "But maybe you should know. Especially if you're hearing things at night." Margaret felt her coffee grow cold in her hands as James began to speak, his voice low and measured. The story he told was one that had been whispered in Millbrook for over a century, a tale that the town's tourism board certainly didn't include in their promotional materials. In 1887, a young woman named Elena Vasquez had come to Millbrook as a mail-order bride. She'd traveled from New Mexico to marry Thomas Whitmore, a prosperous mill owner who'd advertised for a wife in several Western newspapers. Elena was 19, beautiful, and spoke limited English, but she was determined to build a new life in Vermont with the man who'd promised her love and security. The marriage, however, had been a nightmare from the beginning. Thomas Whitmore was a cruel man who drank heavily and had a violent temper. He'd hidden his true nature in his letters, presenting himself as a kind and prosperous businessman. Elena found herself trapped in a foreign place, with no family, no friends, and a husband who treated her more like property than a person. The townspeople knew, James said, his voice heavy with old shame. They could see the bruises, hear the arguments. But back then, a man's home was his castle, and what happened behind closed doors wasn't considered anyone else's business. Margaret felt her stomach clench as James continued the story. Elena had endured the abuse for 2 years, becoming increasingly isolated and desperate. She tried to leave several times, but Thomas always found her and brought her back. In a small town like Millbrook, there was nowhere to hide, and the few people who might have helped her were too afraid of Thomas's influence and temper to intervene. The end came on a cold October night in 1889. Elena, pregnant with her first child and weakened by months of malnutrition and abuse, had tried once more to escape. She'd made it as far as Hollow Creek before Thomas caught up with her. In his drunken rage, he'd struck her so violently that she'd fallen into the rushing water. Whether her death was murder or a tragic accident remained a matter of debate, but the result was the same. Elena Vasquez drowned in Hollow Creek at the age of 21, taking her unborn child with her. They found her body 3 days later, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas claimed she'd slipped and fallen, and the authorities accepted his story. Elena was buried in the town cemetery in an unmarked grave, and life went on. But, Margaret prompted, sensing there was more to the story. James looked toward the window again, where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen across the yard. But some say Elena never found peace. People started reporting strange sounds near the creek, crying, wailing, sometimes what sounded like a woman calling for help. It's been over a century, and folks still hear it. Most nights it's quiet, but on certain nights, especially in October. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. You think what I heard last night was... I don't know what to think, James said honestly. I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've heard the stories. Some I believe, some I don't. But I've also heard things I can't explain, especially on nights when the moon is full and the creek runs high. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of rushing water drifted through the window. Hollow Creek, swollen by recent rains, murmuring its ancient secrets to anyone willing to listen. Margaret found herself staring at the silver ribbon, visible through the trees, wondering what other secrets it might hold. That evening, as darkness settled over Millbrook like a familiar blanket, Margaret found herself unable to focus on her usual activities. The book she'd been reading lay forgotten on her lap as she sat in her living room, straining to hear every sound from outside. The rational part of her mind insisted that James's story was nothing more than local folklore, the kind of ghost tale that every small town seemed to accumulate over the decades. But another part of her, the part that had spent decades ministering to the sick and dying, knew that some experiences transcended rational explanation. She'd seen things in her career that couldn't be easily categorized, moments of inexplicable peace, instances of profound connection that seemed to bridge the gap between life and whatever lay beyond. As the clock in her hallway chimed 11:30, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She retrieved her smartphone from the kitchen counter and checked its recording function. If the crying returned tonight, she would capture it. She would have proof, something concrete to analyze in the light of day. She settled into the chair by her bedroom window, the phone ready in her hands, and waited for midnight to arrive. The October night wrapped around Margaret's house like a velvet shroud, thick with the scent of wood smoke and decomposing leaves. She sat motionless in the darkness of her bedroom, her phone clutched in her hands, watching the digital display count down the minutes to midnight. Her eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and she could make out the silhouettes of the oak trees that lined Hollow Creek, their branches swaying gently in the cool night breeze. At 11:58 p.m., she activated the recording function on her phone, not wanting to miss even a second if the crying returned. Her heart was beating so loudly she worried it might interfere with the recording, but she forced herself to remain still and focused. James Morrison's story had haunted her thoughts all day, and she found herself wondering about Elena Vasquez, a young woman who had traveled so far from home only to meet such a tragic end. Midnight arrived with the distant chiming of the town hall clock, its bronze tones carrying clearly through the still air. Margaret held her breath, counting the 12 strokes, and then silence. Minutes passed with no sound, except the gentle rush of water over stones and the occasional rustle of leaves. Margaret began to wonder if she'd imagined the entire experience from the night before, if grief and loneliness had somehow conjured the crying from her own subconscious need for connection. Then, at 12:07 a.m., it began. The sound rose from the direction of Hollow Creek like a prayer torn from a breaking heart. It was even more devastating than Margaret remembered. A keening that seemed to contain all the world's sorrow, compressed into a single, wordless lament. Her hands trembled as she held the phone steady, watching the recording app capture the audio waves as they peaked and fell. But this time, listening with the focused attention of someone actively documenting the experience, Margaret began to notice details that had escaped her the night before. The crying wasn't random or chaotic. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm that reminded her of a song she couldn't quite place. It would rise to a crescendo of anguish, then fall to barely audible whispers, only to build again with even greater intensity. More disturbing still was the quality of the voice. Margaret had spent decades listening to human pain in all its forms. The cries of sick children, the anguish of grieving parents, the quiet desperation of those facing their own mortality. This sound contained all of that and more, but there was something else woven through it, something that made her skin crawl with recognition she couldn't name. As she listened, Margaret began to make out what sounded like words buried within the crying. They were faint, almost subliminal, but they seemed to be in a language she didn't recognize. Possibly Spanish, though the distortion made it impossible to be certain. She pressed the phone closer to the window, desperately trying to capture every nuance of the haunting sound. The crying continued for nearly 40 minutes, longer than it had lasted the previous night. Margaret's arms ached from holding the phone steady, but she didn't dare move, afraid of missing something crucial. As the sound finally began to fade, she thought she heard something that made her blood run cold, what sounded distinctly like a woman's voice calling out a single word. Help. The word was in English, clear and unmistakable, filled with such desperate pleading that Margaret almost opened her window to call back. But before she could act, silence reclaimed the night, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the gentle murmur of Hollow Creek. Margaret sat in the darkness for another hour, waiting to see if the crying would return, but the night remained quiet. When she finally looked at her phone, she was amazed to see that she'd captured nearly 50 minutes of audio. Her hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, she saved the file and plugged the phone into its charger. Sleep was impossible. Margaret found herself pacing her house, moving from room to room as if the walls themselves held answers to the questions burning in her mind. She made tea with hands that still trembled and sat at her kitchen table watching the first pale hints of dawn creep across the eastern sky. As soon as she judged it to be a reasonable hour, Margaret called James Morrison. His phone rang 4 times before his groggy voice answered. "James, it's Margaret," she said without preamble. "It happened again last night, and I recorded it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When James spoke again, his voice was wide awake and worried. "Margaret, maybe you should—" "I need to show you something," she interrupted. "Can you come over? I think you need to hear this." James arrived 20 minutes later, his gray hair uncombed and his face grave with concern. He accepted Margaret's offer of coffee and sat at her kitchen table while she retrieved her phone from the bedroom. In the clear light of morning, surrounded by the familiar domestic comforts of coffee cups and morning sunlight, the events of the night seemed almost surreal. "Before I play this," Margaret said, settling across from James, "I want you to know that I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday." "About Elena?" James nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "And? If what I recorded is really... If it's really her, then she's been crying for help for over a century, and no one has answered. Margaret's voice caught slightly. As a nurse, as someone who spent her career helping people in pain, I can't just ignore this. Margaret, James said gently, sometimes the best thing we can do is leave the past alone. Some things are beyond our help. But Margaret was already pressing play on the recording. The sound that emerged from her phone's small speaker was tinny and compressed, but it carried enough of the original's emotional power to make both of them fall silent. James's face went pale as the crying filled Margaret's kitchen, and she watched his hands tighten around his coffee mug. When the recording reached the moment where the voice called out, "Help!" James actually flinched. Margaret paused the playback and looked at her neighbor, seeing her own questions reflected in his troubled eyes. "You've heard this before, haven't you?" she said. James was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My wife used to hear it, Sarah. She passed away 3 years ago, but before that she would wake me up sometimes, claiming she heard crying from the creek. I always told her it was probably an animal, or the wind through the trees. But you didn't believe that." "No," he admitted. "I didn't. Because I'd heard it too, though I never told Sarah that. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. That if we didn't talk about it, it wouldn't be real." Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "James, I think Elena is still trying to tell us something. This isn't just random crying. Listen to the pattern, the way it builds and fades, and that word at the end, that plea for help. What if she's been trying to communicate all these years, and no one has been listening?" James looked up at her, and she saw fear warring with something else in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or a long-suppressed need to understand. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we find out what really happened to Elena Vasquez. The real story, not just the version that Thomas Whitmore told the authorities. There have to be records, documents, something that might give us a clearer picture of her final days." "Margaret, that was over a century ago. Most of the people who were alive then have been dead for decades. But their records might still exist. Cemetery records, church documents, maybe even police reports. And if Elena really is trying to communicate with us, then maybe we owe it to her to listen." James was quiet for several minutes, and Margaret could see him wrestling with decades of ingrained caution. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression of resignation mixed with determination. "There's someone we could talk to," he said slowly. "Dorothy Kellerman. She's 93 and lives over at Sunset Manor. Her grandmother was Elena's only friend in town, one of the few people who tried to help her. Dorothy used to tell stories about Elena that her grandmother had passed down, stories that were quite different from the official version." Margaret felt a spark of hope. "Would she talk to us?" "I think so. Dorothy's always been interested in setting the record straight about the town's history. She's been trying for years to get the Historical Society to put up a proper marker for Elena's grave." "Elena has a grave?" "Of sorts. It's in the old section of Millbrook Cemetery, but like I said, it's unmarked. Dorothy knows where it is, though. She visits it sometimes, leaves flowers." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since retiring from nursing. Elena Vasquez had been alone in her suffering for over a century, her story silenced by shame and fear. But now, perhaps, it was time for someone to finally listen. "When can we see her?" Margaret asked. James glanced at the clock on Margaret's kitchen wall. "Visiting hours at Sunset Manor start at 10. If you're really determined to do this, we could go today." Margaret was already standing, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. "I'm going to take a shower and get dressed. Can you pick me up in an hour?" As James nodded and headed for the door, Margaret called after him. "James, thank you for believing me and for being willing to help." He paused in her doorway, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Margaret, I think maybe it's time someone finally listened to Elena's story. Maybe that's what she's been waiting for all these years. Not just to be heard, but to be believed." After James left, Margaret stood in her kitchen listening to the silence, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Instead, it seemed pregnant with possibility, as if the very air were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She climbed the stairs to get ready for what she suspected would be a very important conversation, unaware that Dorothy Kellerman had been waiting her entire life for someone to ask the right questions about Elena Vasquez. The Sunset Manor assisted living facility sat on a gentle hill overlooking downtown Millbrook, its brick facade and well-maintained gardens, giving it the appearance of a comfortable country estate rather than a care facility. Margaret walked beside James Morrison up the curved pathway, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation. In her purse, she carried her phone with the previous night's recording, along with a small notebook and pen. The reception area smelled of lavender and fresh coffee, and the cheerful woman at the front desk directed them to the sunroom where Dorothy Kellerman spent most of her afternoons. They found her sitting by a large window that offered a sweeping view of the town below, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her bright blue eyes alert and curious behind wire-rimmed glasses. Dorothy Kellerman was tiny, perhaps 5 feet tall and no more than 90 pounds, but there was nothing frail about her presence. She wore a soft purple sweater and had a hand-knitted afghan draped across her lap. When she saw James approaching, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "James Morrison, you old devil," she said, her voice carrying the clear tones of someone who had once been a teacher. "It's been too long since you visited me." "Hello, Dorothy," James replied, bending to kiss her cheek. "I've brought someone I'd like you to meet. This is Margaret Chen, my new neighbor on Maple Street." Dorothy's sharp eyes fixed on Margaret with keen interest. "The new lady in the Harrison place. I heard you moved up from Boston. What brings you to our little town, dear?" Margaret settled into the chair across from Dorothy, immediately struck by the woman's direct gaze and obvious intelligence. "I retired recently and was looking for somewhere quiet to write my memoirs. Millbrook seemed perfect." "And is it?" "Perfect, I mean." Margaret exchanged a glance with James, who nodded encouragingly. "Well, that's actually why we're here. I've been experiencing something unusual, and James thought you might be able to help me understand it." Dorothy's expression shifted subtly, becoming more focused and serious. "What kind of unusual?" Margaret took a breath and began to describe the crying she'd heard on both nights, watching Dorothy's face carefully for any sign of recognition or dismissal. But the elderly woman simply listened intently, occasionally nodding, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. When Margaret finished her account, Dorothy was quiet for several moments, her gnarled hands folded carefully in her lap. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You recorded it, didn't you?" Margaret blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because you have the look of someone who's encountered something that defies explanation, but you're the practical sort who needs proof." Dorothy's smile was knowing. "May I hear it?" Margaret retrieved her phone and played the recording, watching Dorothy's face as the haunting sound filled their corner of the sunroom. Several other residents looked their way with curiosity, but Dorothy seemed oblivious to everything except the voice emerging from the small speaker. When the recording ended with Elena's desperate plea for help, Dorothy's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She reached across the small table between them and placed her hand over Margaret's. "That's Elena," she said simply. "I've been waiting my entire life for someone like you to hear her properly." "James told me your grandmother knew Elena," Margaret said gently. Dorothy nodded, settling back in her chair as if preparing for a long story. "My grandmother, Ruth Kellerman, was the closest thing to a friend that Elena had in this town. Grandma Ruth was married to the town doctor, and she often helped him with his patients. She had a kind heart and spoke a little Spanish from her own childhood in California." Margaret pulled out her notebook, and Dorothy smiled approvingly at the gesture. "The official story about Elena's death is a lie," Dorothy continued, her voice gaining strength. "Thomas Whitmore murdered her, as sure as we're sitting here, and half the town knew it. But Thomas was a powerful man. He owned the mill that employed most of the town's men, and he had friends in the sheriff's department." "What really happened that night?" Margaret asked. Dorothy's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing into the past. "According to what my grandmother told me, Elena had been planning her escape for weeks. She'd been hiding food and a little money that she'd managed to save from the household accounts. She was pregnant, you see, and she was terrified of what Thomas might do to her child." Margaret felt her chest tighten with sympathetic pain. She was trying to protect her baby. Yes, Grandma Ruth had been helping her in secret, giving her advice about safe places to go, even offering to help her get to the train station. But Elena was afraid that if she involved others, Thomas would take his anger out on them too. Dorothy paused to sip from a cup of tea that sat on the table beside her chair, and Margaret could see the weight of the story she was carrying. The night Elena died, she'd finally worked up the courage to run. She waited until Thomas passed out drunk, as he did most nights, then took her few belongings and headed for Hollow Creek. Her plan was to follow the creek downstream to where it met the main road, then walk to the next town where she could catch a train. "But Thomas woke up?" James prompted. He did, and when he found her gone, he flew into a rage unlike anything the town had ever seen. Several neighbors heard him shouting and breaking things in his house. Then they heard him leave, and they knew he'd gone after her. Dorothy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Grandma Ruth couldn't sleep that night. She had a feeling something terrible was going to happen. So she put on her coat and walked down to Hollow Creek, thinking maybe she could help Elena get away safely. Margaret felt her heart begin to race. She witnessed what happened. She got there just as Thomas caught up with Elena. My grandmother hid behind a tree and watched the whole thing. Dorothy's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Elena was standing in the shallow part of the creek, trying to cross to the other side. She was begging Thomas to let her go, telling him she would never bother him again if he would just let her leave with her baby. The sunroom suddenly felt very quiet, as if the other residents sensed the gravity of the story being shared in their midst. Thomas was drunk and furious. He waded into the creek after her, screaming about how she belonged to him and how no one would ever want a woman who'd been used by him. Elena tried to run, but she slipped on the wet stones and fell into the deeper part of the creek. Dorothy paused, and Margaret could see her gathering strength to finish the story. Instead of helping her, Thomas held her down. My grandmother said Elena fought and screamed, but the sound of the rushing water covered most of it. Thomas held her underwater until she stopped moving. Then he just let her go. Let her body float downstream. The three of them sat in silence for several moments, the weight of Dorothy's revelation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Margaret felt sick thinking about Elena's final moments. Alone, terrified, fighting for both her life and her unborn child's life. "What happened to your grandmother?" Margaret asked when she found her voice again. She was too afraid to come forward immediately. Thomas was dangerous, and she had a family to protect. But the guilt ate at her for the rest of her life. "She made my mother promise to tell me the truth about Elena's death, and she made me promise to never let the story die completely." "And that's what you've been doing all these years," James said. "Keeping Elena's memory alive." Dorothy nodded. "I visit her grave every month. I've tried to get the Historical Society to acknowledge what really happened, but there are still people in this town whose families were connected to Thomas Whitmore. They don't want their ancestors' reputations tarnished by association." Margaret looked up from her notebook, where she'd been recording Dorothy's account. "Where exactly is Elena's grave?" "In the northeast corner of Millbrook Cemetery, Section C, row 15. It's just a small stone with the initials EV and the year 1889. I had the initials added myself about 20 years ago. Before that, there was no marker at all." "Dorothy," Margaret said carefully, "do you think Elena's spirit is still active because her story was never properly told? Because she never received justice?" The elderly woman smiled sadly. "I think Elena has been trying to tell people what really happened for over a century, but no one has been willing to listen. Until now." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean until now?" "The crying you've been hearing. It always happens around the anniversary of her death, October 23rd, 1889. That's when she died, and every year around this time, people report hearing the same thing you've described. But you're the first person I know of who's recorded it, who's taken it seriously enough to investigate." Margaret calculated quickly in her head. "October 23rd RD. That's tomorrow night." Dorothy nodded gravely. "Which means tonight might be your last chance to hear Elena's full story. If she truly is trying to communicate, tomorrow night, on the anniversary, might be when she tells you everything." As they prepared to leave Sunset Manor, Dorothy pressed a piece of paper into Margaret's hand. "That's the location of Elena's grave. I think you should visit her. Let her know that someone finally believes her story." Walking back to James's truck, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Elena Vasquez had been failed by everyone who might have helped her in life, and her death had been covered up by fear and complicity. But now, more than a century later, someone was finally listening to her desperate pleas for help. The question that haunted Margaret as they drove back to Maple Street was, what exactly was Elena asking them to do? Margaret spent the day of October 23rd preparing for what she suspected would be the most important night since she'd moved to Millbrook. She charged multiple devices capable of recording: her phone, an old digital recorder she'd found in a box from her Boston apartment, and even her laptop, which she positioned by her bedroom window. If Elena Vasquez was going to tell her story on the anniversary of her death, Margaret was determined to capture every word. James Morrison had offered to spend the night at her house, bringing his own recording equipment and providing moral support. But Margaret had politely declined. Something told her that this needed to be a solitary vigil, that Elena had chosen to communicate with her specifically for reasons she didn't yet understand. The cemetery visit that afternoon had been both heartbreaking and illuminating. Elena's grave was exactly where Dorothy had indicated, a small, weathered stone bearing only the initials EV and the year 1889 in barely legible engraving. Margaret had brought a bouquet of white roses and spent nearly an hour sitting beside the modest marker, talking quietly to the woman buried beneath the Vermont soil. "I know what really happened to you," she had whispered, placing the flowers against the stone. "I know Thomas murdered you, and I know you've been trying to tell people for all these years. Tonight, I'm going to listen to everything you have to say." A cool breeze had stirred the fallen leaves around Elena's grave, and Margaret had felt an odd sense of anticipation, as if something were building toward a crucial moment. Now, as darkness fell over Maple Street, Margaret sat in her bedroom with her recording devices arrayed before her like offerings. She'd made herself a thermos of coffee and wrapped herself in a warm blanket, prepared to spend the entire night listening if necessary. The October night was clearer than it had been during her previous vigils, with a nearly full moon casting silver light across the landscape. Through her window, she could see Hollow Creek running high from recent rains, its surface catching and reflecting the moonlight as it flowed toward its eventual meeting with the Connecticut River. At 11:45 p.m., Margaret activated all her recording devices and settled in to wait. The house around her seemed to hold its breath, as if it too understood the significance of this anniversary night. Even the usual sounds of settling wood and humming appliances seemed muted, creating an atmosphere of expectant silence. Midnight arrived with the distant chiming of the town hall clock, and Margaret counted each of the 12 strokes, her heart beating in rhythm with the bronze tones. As the last chime faded into silence, she waited, her hands steady on her phone despite the anxiety coursing through her veins. For nearly 10 minutes, there was only the sound of water over stones and the whisper of wind through bare tree branches. Margaret began to wonder if she'd been wrong about the significance of this date, if her meeting with Dorothy had somehow influenced her expectations. Then, at 12:09 a.m., it began. But this time, the crying was different. It started, as it always had, a mournful keening that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. But as Margaret listened with the focused attention of someone who had spent days preparing for this moment, she realized that what she was hearing wasn't simply random grief. There was structure to it, pattern, almost like a narrative being told in the universal language of sorrow. The crying rose and fell in distinct phases, and Margaret found herself thinking of it as chapters in Elena's story. The first phase seemed to speak of homesickness and loneliness, the crying of a young woman far from everything familiar, struggling to communicate in a foreign language with people who saw her as an outsider. The second phase carried a different quality of pain, the sharp, staccato sobs of physical and emotional abuse, the sound of someone learning to muffle their cries so as not to anger their tormentor further. Margaret felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she listened to this expression of systematic brutalization. The third phase was perhaps the most heartbreaking, a softer, more complex weeping that seemed to speak of hope and fear intertwined. This was the crying of a pregnant woman, Margaret realized. Someone who had discovered new life growing within her, even as her own life had become unbearable. But it was the fourth phase that made Margaret's blood run cold. The crying became desperate, urgent, filled with the terror of someone who knew death was approaching. And woven through this final lament, Margaret could make out words, first in Spanish, then increasingly in heavily accented English. "Por favor, please, help me." The voice was clear now, no longer just a sound carried on the wind, but an actual communication directed specifically at Margaret. He comes. Thomas comes. I cannot run. Margaret's hands shook as she held her phone steady, watching the audio levels spike and fall as Elena's voice grew stronger and more distinct. My baby. Save my baby. In the water. So cold. Can't breathe. Thomas holds me down. Won't let me up. Help us. Someone help us. The description of Elena's final moments was so vivid, so immediate, that Margaret felt as if she were standing on the bank of Hollow Creek in 1889, watching helplessly as Thomas Whitmore murdered his young wife. The crying intensified, becoming a sound that seemed to contain all the injustice and pain of the world compressed into a single voice. Truth. Need truth. Tell them truth. Thomas killed me. Killed my baby. Not accident. Murder. Cold water. Can't breathe. Darkness. The voice began to fade, but Elena wasn't finished. With what seemed like tremendous effort, she spoke directly to Margaret, her words clear and unmistakable. You listen. You believe. Margaret, who listens. Find the witness. Ruth saw. Ruth knows. Tell them, Ruth saw everything. In the ground, by the big oak. Thomas hid. Find what Thomas hid. The voice was fading now, becoming distant and ethereal, but Elena managed one final, heartbreaking plea. Justice. Need justice. For me. For baby. For all the women. Tell them. Tell them Elena Vasquez was murdered. Tell them. And then silence reclaimed the night, leaving Margaret alone with her recordings and the profound weight of what she had just experienced. She sat motionless for nearly an hour, tears streaming down her face, before finally turning off her devices and checking to make sure the recordings had captured everything. They had 4 different devices, 4 perfect recordings of Elena Vasquez finally telling her complete story after more than a century of trying to communicate with the living world. But Elena's message had contained more than just an account of her murder. She had given Margaret specific information, references to Ruth as a witness, Dorothy's grandmother, who had indeed witnessed the crime, and something about Thomas hiding evidence. In the ground by the big oak, Margaret's mind raced as she considered the implications. Was Elena telling her that Thomas had buried evidence of his crime? And if so, where was this big oak she had mentioned? Margaret barely slept that night, and as soon as morning arrived, she called James Morrison. His phone rang only once before his worried voice answered. Margaret? Are you all right? I've been worried sick about you all night. James, I need you to come over immediately and call Dorothy. See if she can join us. Elena spoke to me last night. Really spoke. And she gave us information that could change everything. 2 hours later, Margaret's kitchen table was once again the site of an extraordinary conversation. Dorothy had convinced the staff at Sunset Manor to let her have an extended visit with friends, and she sat beside James listening to Margaret's recordings with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. That's her, Dorothy whispered when the recordings ended. That's Elena's voice. I've heard stories about her accent, how hard it was for her to make herself understood in English. Oh, that poor brave girl. Dorothy, Margaret said urgently, Elena mentioned that your grandmother was a witness. She said, Ruth saw, Ruth knows. Did your grandmother ever tell you anything about Thomas hiding evidence? Dorothy's eyes widened with recognition. Oh my goodness, yes, she did mention something, but I'd almost forgotten. Grandma Ruth said that after Elena's body was found, she noticed Thomas acting strangely nervous, more so than would be expected, even for a grieving widower. She saw him several times digging in his backyard at night. Digging where, specifically? James asked. By the old oak tree behind his house. It was a massive tree, probably 200 years old. Grandma Ruth said Thomas would go out there with a lantern and a shovel, but she never knew what he was burying. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Where was Thomas Whitmore's house? Does it still exist? Dorothy shook her head. The house was torn down in the 1940s, but I know exactly where it stood. It's part of Millbrook Commons now. You know, that little park on the east side of town with the playground and walking trails. And the oak tree? Margaret pressed. Still there. It's the big one in the center of the Commons, the one with the historical marker about the town's founding. Everyone just calls it the Charter Oak now. Margaret stood up abruptly, her mind racing with possibilities. We need to go there. If Thomas buried evidence of Elena's murder, and if it's still in the ground after all these years, Margaret, James said carefully, what are you suggesting? That we just start digging in a public park? I'm suggesting we contact the authorities and tell them what we've discovered. Elena specifically told me to find what Thomas hid. She's been trying to solve her own murder for over a century. The least we can do is follow her leads. Dorothy was nodding enthusiastically. There's a new police chief in town, Sarah Martinez. She's young and progressive, not like the old boys, club that used to run things. She might actually listen to us. Even if we tell her we got our information from a ghost? James asked skeptically. Margaret looked at her neighbor with determination. We don't tell her about Elena directly. We tell her about Dorothy's grandmother's testimony, about the historical evidence we've uncovered. We present it as a cold case investigation based on new information. Dorothy smiled at Margaret with something approaching admiration. You really are going to do this, aren't you? You're really going to get justice for Elena. I'm going to try, Margaret said firmly. Elena asked for my help specifically. She could have communicated with anyone over the past century, but she chose to speak to me. I think I know why now. James and Dorothy looked at her expectantly. I spent my entire career advocating for people who couldn't advocate for themselves, children, patients who were too sick to speak up, families who didn't understand the medical system. Elena chose someone who would listen, who would believe, and who wouldn't give up until the truth was told. Margaret walked to her window and looked out toward Hollow Creek, where the morning sunlight was turning the water into a ribbon of gold. Somewhere in that creek, Elena Vasquez had died a violent death, taking her unborn child with her into the cold October water. But she had never stopped fighting for justice, never stopped trying to tell her story. Now finally, someone was listening. Police Chief Sarah Martinez was younger than Margaret had expected, probably in her early 40s. With intelligent dark eyes and prematurely gray hair that she wore in a practical ponytail. She listened to their story with the focused attention of someone accustomed to separating facts from speculation, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook she kept on her desk. Margaret, James, and Dorothy sat in the small conference room at the Millbrook Police Department, having spent the morning carefully preparing their presentation. They had decided to focus on Dorothy's family testimony and the historical inconsistencies in Elena's death record, mentioning the recordings only as unusual audio phenomena that had prompted them to investigate the old case. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Chief Martinez said after they'd finished their account. You're telling me that we have potential evidence of a 19th century murder based on testimony that was passed down through 3 generations of the Kellerman family? The testimony of an eyewitness, Dorothy corrected firmly. My grandmother saw Thomas Whitmore murder his wife. She was too frightened to come forward at the time, but she told my mother and me the truth. Chief Martinez looked thoughtful. And you believe there may be physical evidence buried in Millbrook Commons? Elena's voice on the recording specifically mentioned that Thomas hid something by the big oak, Margaret said, then caught herself. I mean, we have reason to believe that Thomas may have buried evidence there. The police chief studied Margaret with sharp eyes, clearly picking up on her slip. Ms. Chen, are you telling me that you believe you've been communicating with Elena Vasquez's ghost? Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but Dorothy answered before she could speak. Chief Martinez, does it matter what prompted us to investigate? The fact remains that we have credible testimony about a murder that was covered up, and we have a specific location where evidence might be found. Chief Martinez was quiet for several moments, tapping her pen against her notebook. Finally, she looked up at the 3 of them with an expression that was both skeptical and curious. I've been police chief here for 5 years, and I've heard whispers about Elena Vasquez the entire time, mostly from older residents who seem to think there was more to her death than what was officially recorded. But no one has ever come forward with specific allegations before. Because no one wanted to speak ill of Thomas Whitmore, James said. His family had influence in this town for generations. Had influence, Chief Martinez noted. The last of the Whitmores moved away in the 1980s. There's no one left to protect. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. Chief Martinez, what would it take to get permission to examine the ground around the Charter Oak? Even if we found nothing, at least we'd know we followed every lead. The police chief considered this for a long moment. The commons are public property, so the town would have to approve any excavation. And we'd need ground-penetrating radar to identify any anomalies before we started digging blindly. She paused, then looked directly at Margaret. It would be expensive, and it would certainly attract attention. Are you prepared for that? Margaret thought about Elena's desperate voice pleading for justice, about a young woman who had died alone and terrified while her murderer lived freely for the rest of his life. Yes, she said firmly, I'm prepared for whatever it takes. Chief Martinez closed her notebook and stood up. Give me 24 hours to make some calls. I know someone at the state university who does archaeological surveys. If he's willing to do this as a research project, it might not cost the town anything. As they left the police station, Dorothy was practically vibrating with excitement. I can't believe it, she said, clutching Margaret's arm. After all these years, someone is finally taking Elena's story seriously. That evening, Margaret sat by her window as she had for the past several nights, but the creek remained silent. She wondered if Elena's communication had been complete, if the anniversary night had been her one opportunity to tell her full story. The silence felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if Elena were waiting to see what would happen next. 2 days later, Chief Martinez called with news that made Margaret's heart race. Dr. Richard Hawthorne from the University of Vermont's Archaeology Department was not only willing to survey the site, he was fascinated by the historical mystery. He would bring ground-penetrating radar equipment to Millbrook Commons the following Monday. Word of the investigation spread through the small town with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By the weekend, Margaret found herself fielding phone calls from curious neighbors and even a reporter from the local newspaper. Some callers were supportive and excited about the possibility of solving a historical mystery. Others were less enthusiastic, suggesting that some things were better left buried. One call, however, was particularly disturbing. It came on Sunday evening, just as Margaret was preparing for bed. You should stop digging into things that don't concern you, said a gravelly male voice she didn't recognize. Some stories are meant to stay buried. Who is this? Margaret demanded, but the line went dead. She immediately called Chief Martinez, who took the threat seriously enough to drive over to Margaret's house personally. I'm going to have a patrol car drive by your house a few extra times tonight, the chief said, standing in Margaret's kitchen with a stern expression. Do you have any idea who might want to discourage this investigation? Margaret shook her head, but a chill ran down her spine as she thought about Elena's story. The young woman had been murdered not just by her husband, but by a whole system that had been willing to look the other way. Were there still people in Millbrook who wanted to protect that conspiracy of silence? Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, perfect weather for what Dr. Hawthorne called archaeological detective work. Margaret, James, and Dorothy gathered in Millbrook Commons, along with a growing crowd of curious townspeople to watch as the university professor and his graduate students set up their equipment. The charter oak was indeed an impressive tree, easily 6 feet in diameter, with massive branches that created a natural canopy over much of the central commons area. Dr. Hawthorne, an energetic man in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, explained the process as his students calibrated the ground-penetrating radar unit. We're looking for anomalies in the soil density, he said to the gathered crowd. If someone buried something here over a century ago, there should still be detectable differences in how the radar signals bounce back from the ground. Margaret found herself holding her breath as the team began their systematic survey of the area around the massive oak tree. The radar unit looked like a large lawnmower being pushed back and forth in carefully measured grids, with data appearing on laptop screens that Dr. Hawthorne and his students monitored intently. After 2 hours of methodical work, one of the graduate students called out excitedly, "Professor, you need to see this, Dr." Hawthorne hurried over to examine the laptop screen, his expression growing more interested by the minute. Margaret watched his face, trying to read the significance of whatever the radar had detected. Finally, the professor looked up at the crowd with obvious excitement. We have a significant anomaly approximately 3 feet east of the oak's main trunk. The radar indicates a rectangular area of disturbed soil about 4 feet by 2 feet, buried approximately 3 feet deep. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Margaret felt her heart begin to race. Dorothy gripped her arm tightly, her eyes bright with anticipation. "What does that mean?" called out one of the spectators. Dr. Hawthorne smiled. "It means someone definitely buried something here, probably in a wooden box or container. The size and shape are consistent with the kind of evidence box that might have been used in the 19th century. He looked directly at Margaret. "I'd say your historical investigation just got very interesting." Chief Martinez stepped forward. Dr. Hawthorne, what's the next step? We excavate, he said simply, carefully and methodically, documenting everything we find. If there really is evidence of a 19th century crime buried here, we want to make sure it's handled properly. As the crowd began to disperse, many people making plans to return for the excavation, Margaret remained standing beside the charter oak. She placed her hand against the ancient bark and thought about Elena Vasquez, wondering if the young woman somehow knew that her century-long quest for justice was finally nearing its end. That night, Hollow Creek remained silent, but Margaret felt a sense of anticipation that made sleep impossible. Tomorrow they would discover what Thomas Whitmore had been so desperate to hide. Tomorrow, Elena might finally get the justice she had been seeking for over 100 years. The excavation began at dawn on Tuesday morning, with Dr. Hawthorne insisting on proper archaeological protocols, despite the eager crowd of spectators that had already begun gathering in Millbrook Commons. Margaret arrived early with coffee and breakfast pastries for the research team, her stomach too twisted with nervous anticipation to eat anything herself. Chief Martinez had established a perimeter around the dig site, keeping curious onlookers at a respectful distance while still allowing them to observe the proceedings. Dorothy Kellerman had arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by one of the staff members from Sunset Manor, her eyes bright with excitement and determination despite her age and frailty. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," she told Margaret firmly. "I promised my grandmother I would never let Elena's story die, and today we might finally be able to honor that promise." Dr. Hawthorne and his graduate students worked with painstaking precision, removing soil one careful layer at a time and sifting everything through fine screens to ensure that no small artifacts would be missed. Margaret found herself mesmerized by the process, watching as the centuries slowly peeled away to reveal whatever Thomas Whitmore had buried beneath the charter oak. At 10:30 a.m., one of the graduate students' trowels struck something solid. "Professor!" she called out, excitement evident in her voice despite her attempt to maintain professional composure. "We've got wood." Dr. Hawthorne immediately joined his student in the excavation pit, and Margaret watched as they carefully exposed what appeared to be the corner of a wooden box. The wood was darkened with age, but remarkably well preserved, protected by the Vermont soil and the massive root system of the oak tree. "It's definitely a container of some kind," Dr. Hawthorne announced to the waiting crowd. "Probably pine construction, consistent with 19th century carpentry techniques." The excavation proceeded even more slowly now, with the team taking photographs and measurements at every stage. Margaret felt as if hours passed, though her watch indicated it was only another 30 minutes before they had fully exposed the top of the box. "It's approximately 18 inches by 12 inches by 10 inches deep," Dr. Hawthorne reported. "The construction suggests it was made specifically for storage rather than being repurposed from something else." Chief Martinez stepped closer to the edge of the pit. "Are you able to lift it out?" "We're going to try. Sarah, can you hand me those canvas slings?" Working together, the team carefully lifted the wooden box from its century-old resting place. Despite its age, it appeared to be structurally sound, though the metal hinges had long since corroded away. Dr. Hawthorne carried it to a folding table that had been set up nearby, and Margaret found herself holding her breath as he prepared to open Elena's potential evidence box. "Before we proceed," Chief Martinez announced to the crowd, "I want everyone to understand that if this box contains evidence related to a crime, even a crime from 1889, it needs to be handled as potential evidence in an official investigation." Margaret watched as Dr. Hawthorne carefully pried open the lid of the wooden box, his movements deliberate and respectful. The hinges cracked with age, but the lid lifted cleanly, revealing contents that made several people in the crowd gasp audibly. The box contained what appeared to be clothing, a woman's dress, carefully folded but stained with what looked like dried blood. Beneath the dress were other items, a pair of women's boots, also blood-stained, what appeared to be several pieces of jewelry, and a leather-bound journal or diary. "My God," Chief Martinez breathed, stepping closer to examine the contents. "If this is what I think it is," Dr. Hawthorne was already pulling on latex gloves, preparing to examine the artifacts more closely. "The blood staining on these garments is extensive and appears consistent with violence rather than normal wear or accident," he said, his voice taking on the clinical tone of an expert witness. "And this journal?" He carefully lifted the leather-bound book from the box. It appears to be written in Spanish. Dorothy was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she stared at the evidence that confirmed everything her grandmother had told her. "Those are Elena's clothes," she whispered. "Thomas took them from her body and buried them here to hide what he'd done." Margaret felt a chill run through her as she stared at the blood-stained dress. This was more than just historical evidence. These were the actual clothes that Elena Vasquez had been wearing when she was murdered. The young woman's blood had soaked into the fabric, creating a testimony that had waited over a century to be discovered. Chief Martinez was already on her radio, calling for additional personnel and evidence containers. "We're going to need the state crime lab to examine these artifacts," she announced. "Even though this is a historical case, we need to process this evidence properly." Dr. Hawthorne carefully opened the journal, revealing pages covered in flowing Spanish script. "This appears to be Elena's diary," he said, his voice filled with awe. "If she documented her experiences with Thomas Whitmore..." Margaret stepped closer, peering over the professor's shoulder at the faded ink on the yellowed pages. Even though she couldn't read Spanish, she could see that the handwriting changed dramatically throughout the journal, starting neat and hopeful in the early entries, becoming increasingly shaky and desperate in the later pages. "We'll need someone who can translate this," Chief Martinez said. "This could be Elena's own account of what was happening to her." "I know someone," Margaret said suddenly. "Maria Santos. She teaches Spanish at the high school. She's also interested in historical documents." As the crowd began to disperse, many people making plans to follow the story in the local newspaper, Margaret remained at the dig site with Dorothy and James. The elderly woman was still emotional, overwhelmed by finally seeing physical proof of the story that had haunted her family for generations. "Elena saved her own evidence," Dorothy said, her voice filled with wonder. "She must have hidden these things. And Thomas found them after he killed her. He couldn't just throw them away because someone might find them, so he buried them here, thinking no one would ever look." James nodded thoughtfully. "It makes sense. Thomas would have known that people might ask questions if Elena's personal belongings simply disappeared. By burying them, he made sure no one would ever connect the bloodstains to what really happened." Margaret stared at the charter oak, its massive branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in supplication. For over a century, this tree had stood guard over Elena's evidence, waiting for the right moment to give up its secrets. That evening, Margaret sat by her bedroom window as she had done so many nights before, but now she felt different, purposeful in a way she hadn't experienced since her retirement. Elena's voice had not returned since the anniversary night, but Margaret sensed that the young woman's spirit was somehow present, watching as the wheels of justice finally began to turn. The silence from Hollow Creek no longer felt empty or waiting. Instead, it felt peaceful, as if Elena had finally been able to rest knowing that her story was being told, her evidence discovered, and her truth revealed to the world. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened the recording from the anniversary night, listening once more to Elena's desperate plea for justice. But now, instead of heartbreak, she felt hope. Elena Vasquez had been failed by everyone who might have helped her in 1889, but she had never stopped fighting for the truth. And now, more than a century later, her fight was finally being won. Tomorrow, Maria Santos would translate Elena's diary, and the world would hear the young woman's story in her own words. Thomas Whitmore had thought he could bury the truth along with the evidence, but he had underestimated the power of a woman's determination to be heard. Elena's voice had carried across more than 100 years to reach someone who would listen, someone who would believe, and someone who would never give up until justice was served. Margaret closed the recording app and smiled toward the window, where moonlight danced on the waters of Hollow Creek. "You did it, Elena," she whispered into the peaceful night. "You solved your own murder." Maria Santos arrived at the police station the following morning with the eager anticipation of a scholar presented with a unique historical document. A petite woman in her mid-40s with graying black hair and intelligent brown eyes, she taught advanced placement Spanish at Millbrook High School and had spent summers doing translation work for various historical societies throughout New England. Margaret, James, Dorothy, and Chief Martinez gathered in the conference room as Maria carefully examined Elena's diary, her expression growing more somber with each page she reviewed. The leather-bound journal had been photographed and preserved by the state crime lab. but the original was being made available for translation under strict supervision. "This is extraordinary," Maria said finally, looking up at the assembled group with tears in her eyes. Elena was remarkably articulate and observant. Her Spanish is beautiful, educated and formal, which suggests she came from a good family in New Mexico. She documented everything, including details that... She paused, swallowing hard, including details that will be very difficult to read aloud. Chief Martinez leaned forward. "Ms. Santos, we understand this may contain disturbing content, but we need to know exactly what Elena wrote. This diary could be crucial evidence in establishing what really happened to her." Maria nodded and opened the journal to the first entry. She begins writing shortly after arriving in Millbrook. The early entries are hopeful, even optimistic. Should I translate chronologically? "Please," Margaret said, pulling out her notebook. "I think we need to hear Elena's story in her own words, exactly as she lived it." Maria cleared her throat and began to read, translating Elena's Spanish into English with careful attention to preserving the young woman's voice and tone. March 15, 1887. I have arrived in Vermont after a journey of many days. The train was crowded and uncomfortable, but I was too excited to care. Thomas met me at the station with flowers and seemed pleased with my appearance. He is taller than I expected from his photograph, and his house is much larger than the one I grew up in. I pray that God will bless this marriage and that I will be a good wife to Thomas. Dorothy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. She was so young, so hopeful. Maria continued reading, and Elena's early entries painted a picture of a young woman trying her best to adapt to a new culture and language, while managing the expectations of a husband she barely knew. Thomas was initially kind, though Elena noted that he drank more than she was comfortable with and had a temper when contradicted. April 3, 1887. I am learning English words every day, but Thomas becomes impatient when I cannot understand him quickly. He says I must try harder to fit in with the town people, that they already whisper about his foreign wife. I asked Mrs. Henderson for advice about cooking American food, but Thomas said I should not bother the neighbors with my problems. The entries gradually revealed Thomas's true nature, as his initial courtesy gave way to increasing control and criticism. Elena wrote about being forbidden to leave the house without Thomas's permission, about having her letters to her family in New Mexico intercepted and destroyed, about the growing isolation that left her dependent entirely on her husband's goodwill. June 18, 1887. Thomas struck me today for the first time. I had burned the bread while trying to help him with bookkeeping for the mill, and he said I was useless, that he should have bought a good American woman instead of importing a stupid Mexican girl. The blow knocked me to the floor, and I could taste blood in my mouth. When I tried to explain, he hit me again and told me that a good wife never talks back to her husband. Margaret felt sick as Maria read Elena's increasingly desperate accounts of physical and emotional abuse. The young woman had documented every incident with heartbreaking detail, recording dates, times, and circumstances, as if she somehow knew that these records might someday be important. She was building a case, Chief Martinez observed grimly. Even trapped in that situation, she was gathering evidence. The abuse escalated throughout 1888, with Thomas becoming increasingly violent and unpredictable. Elena wrote about being locked in the cellar for days at a time, about having her food restricted as punishment for perceived slights, about the growing fear that Thomas might actually kill her during one of his drunken rages. January 10, 1889. I believe I am with child. I have not told Thomas yet because I am afraid of how he will react. Part of me is filled with joy at the thought of having a baby, but another part of me is terrified. What kind of father will Thomas be? What if he hurts the child as he hurts me? I pray every night that God will protect this innocent life growing inside me. Dorothy was crying openly now, and even Chief Martinez had to stop taking notes to wipe her eyes. Elena's joy at her pregnancy was tempered by realistic fear for her unborn child's safety, and her entries revealed a growing determination to escape before the baby was born. February 14, 1889. Thomas knows about the baby now. His reaction was worse than I feared. He accused me of trying to trap him, said that he never wanted children and that the baby would just be another burden he couldn't afford. He hit my stomach, and I was so afraid that he had hurt the baby. Mrs. Kellerman saw the bruises when she came to visit, and I think she suspects the truth. She offered to help me, but I am too frightened to involve others in my troubles." Margaret looked at Dorothy, seeing the validation in the elderly woman's eyes. Ruth Kellerman had indeed tried to help Elena, just as Dorothy's family had always maintained. The final entries in Elena's diary revealed her detailed planning for escape and her growing desperation as her pregnancy advanced. She had managed to save small amounts of money from the household accounts, had identified safe routes to the train station, and had even contacted her family in New Mexico about returning home. October 20th, 1889. I cannot wait any longer. The baby will be born soon, and I cannot let Thomas raise this child. I have hidden my few possessions and the money I have saved. When Thomas drinks himself to sleep tonight, I will leave forever. I pray that my family in New Mexico will welcome me home, and that my child will grow up surrounded by love instead of violence. Maria's voice broke as she read the final entry, dated October 23, 1889, the night Elena died. October 23, 1889. Tonight I go home. I am more frightened than I have ever been, but I am also more determined. This child deserves a chance at happiness, and I will do whatever I must to give it that chance. If something happens to me, I pray that someone will find these words and know the truth about Thomas Whitmore. He is a dangerous man who should not be trusted with any woman's life. If I do not survive this night, please know that I tried to save my baby. Please know that I fought for both of us until the end. Silence filled the conference room as Maria closed the diary, and Margaret felt as if Elena's voice had just spoken directly to them across more than a century. The young woman's final words were not just a record of her escape attempt. They were a testimony, a witness statement written by the victim herself. Chief Martinez was the first to speak. This changes everything. Elena's diary provides documented evidence of systematic domestic abuse leading up to her murder. Combined with the physical evidence we found buried under the oak tree, we have a complete picture of what really happened. "What happens now?" James asked. "Now we tell Elena's story properly," Margaret said, her voice strong with determination. "We make sure that everyone knows the truth about what Thomas Whitmore did, and we give Elena the recognition and justice she's been seeking for over a century." Dorothy smiled through her tears. "My grandmother would be so proud. She kept Elena's secret for 70 years, and now the whole world will finally know that she was telling the truth." As the meeting concluded and the various participants began to disperse, Margaret remained in the conference room with Elena's diary, now safely sealed in evidence containers. She thought about the young woman who had written those words, intelligent, brave, determined to protect her unborn child, even as she documented her own abuse for posterity. Elena Vasquez had not just been a victim. She had been a fighter, a survivor who had used the only weapons available to her, her words, her intelligence, and her unwavering hope that someday someone would listen to her story and care enough to seek justice. That someone had finally arrived, more than a century late, but no less determined to honor Elena's courage and ensure that her voice was heard. 6 months after that first night when Margaret heard crying from Hollow Creek, the town of Millbrook gathered for a ceremony that had been more than a century in the making. The morning was perfect. Crisp spring air filled with the scent of apple blossoms and the sound of birdsong from the trees that lined Millbrook Cemetery. Margaret stood beside the new granite headstone that now marked Elena Vasquez's grave, reading the inscription that had been carefully crafted to honor the young woman's life and acknowledge the truth about her death. Elena Maria Vasquez, 1868 to 1889. Beloved daughter, wife, and mother, her voice carried across time until justice was served. Murdered October 23, 1889. Truth revealed 2024. The ceremony was attended by what seemed Maria Santos had prepared a translation of selected passages from Elena's diary, which she read aloud in both Spanish and English, giving Elena's own words the prominent place they deserved in the story of her life and death. Dorothy Kellerman, now 94 but still sharp and determined, sat in her wheelchair at the front of the gathered crowd. She had lived to see her family's testimony vindicated and Elena's story properly told, fulfilling the promise she had made to her grandmother decades earlier. Chief Martinez stood at a small podium that had been set up beside Elena's new headstone, addressing the crowd with the official conclusions of the investigation that had consumed the town's attention for months. The forensic evidence discovered beneath the charter oak, combined with Elena Vasquez's diary entries, provides clear and conclusive proof that Elena was murdered by her husband, Thomas Whitmore, on October 23, 1889. She announced. The blood evidence on Elena's clothing matches the injuries described by witness Ruth Kellerman, and Elena's own written testimony documents a pattern of escalating domestic violence leading up to her death. The investigation had revealed even more than they had initially hoped. Elena's blood-stained clothing had been forensically analyzed using modern techniques, revealing evidence consistent with drowning after blunt force trauma. More importantly, tucked inside one of Elena's boots had been a small piece of paper bearing Ruth Kellerman's name and address, proof that Elena had identified her one ally in Millbrook and had been trying to reach her when Thomas caught up with her at Hollow Creek. Today we officially close the case of Elena Vasquez's murder. Chief Martinez continued. Though we cannot prosecute Thomas Whitmore, who died in 1923, we can ensure that the truth about Elena's death becomes part of the permanent historical record of Millbrook. Margaret looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing tears and nodding heads as people absorbed the significance of what they were witnessing. Elena's story had touched the entire community, reminding them that domestic violence was not a modern problem, and that victims' voices deserved to be heard regardless of when they lived or died. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a second monument, a bronze plaque that would be permanently installed beside Hollow Creek, near the spot where Elena had died. The plaque read, "In memory of Elena Vasquez and all victims of domestic violence, their voices will not be silenced. Millbrook, Vermont, 2024. As the crowd began to disperse, many people stopped to speak with Margaret, thanking her for her persistence in uncovering Elena's story. She had become something of a local celebrity, featured in newspaper articles and even a short documentary about the case that had been produced by the University of Vermont. But the attention that meant the most to Margaret came from an unexpected source. A young woman approached her as she stood beside Elena's new headstone, introducing herself as Dr. Carmen Vasquez Rodriguez, a professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. "Ms. Chen," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile, "I'm Elena's great-great-niece. When news of your investigation reached our family, we were amazed to learn what had happened to our ancestor. Elena's family in New Mexico never knew what became of her after she left for Vermont." Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears as she shook Carmen's hand. She was an extraordinary young woman. Her diary shows how intelligent and brave she was, even in the most terrible circumstances. "Our family has established a scholarship in Elena's name for young women studying domestic violence prevention," Carmen said. "We wanted her story to continue helping people, even today." Margaret felt a deep sense of completion hearing those words. Elena's voice had indeed carried across time, not just to solve her own murder, but to potentially save other lives as well. As the day wore on, and the crowds gradually thinned, Margaret found herself alone at Elena's grave as the sun began to set. James had offered to drive her home, but she had asked for a few minutes alone to say goodbye to the young woman who had changed her life so profoundly. "Thank you," she whispered to the headstone, placing a single white rose beside the fresh flowers that covered the grave. "Thank you for choosing me to hear your story. I hope you can finally rest now." A gentle breeze stirred the trees around the cemetery, and for a moment Margaret could have sworn she heard something carried on the wind. Not crying this time, but what sounded like a sigh of relief, of peace finally found. That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen writing in the journal she had started keeping throughout Elena's investigation. Her memoir project had evolved into something much more significant, a book about Elena's story and the importance of listening to voices that history had tried to silence. As she wrote, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from retirement in Boston to this small Vermont town where a century-old injustice had finally been corrected. She had moved to Millbrook, seeking quiet solitude, but instead had found purpose, community, in the most important case of her life. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Dr. Hawthorne from the University of Vermont. "Margaret, I wanted to let you know that we've received approval to establish a permanent archaeological research station in Millbrook. Elena's case has generated so much interest in historical cold cases that we're getting funding to investigate other unsolved mysteries from the region's past." Margaret smiled, thinking about how Elena's determination to be heard had opened doors for other forgotten voices as well. "That's wonderful, Dr. Hawthorne. I think Elena would be pleased to know that her story is helping others find justice too." After hanging up, Margaret walked to her bedroom window, the same window where she had first heard Elena's crying 6 months earlier. Hollow Creek flowed peacefully in the moonlight, its waters no longer carrying the sound of desperate pleas for help. The creek had returned to its natural voice, the gentle murmur of water over stones, the whisper of wind through reeds, the normal sounds of a Vermont waterway in spring. Margaret had initially thought she was moving to Millbrook to begin the quiet, final chapter of her life. Instead, she had discovered that some of the most important work she would ever do was still ahead of her. Elena's story had reminded her that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, and that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belonged to someone who had been silenced for far too long. She opened her laptop and began typing the final chapter of Elena's story, knowing that it would be read by people who needed to hear about courage, persistence, and the power of one person's determination to listen when others would not. The story of Elena Vasquez had ended not with her death in the cold waters of Hollow Creek, but with justice served and truth revealed. Her voice had carried across more than a century to reach someone who would believe, someone who would act, and someone who would ensure that her story became part of the permanent record of human courage and resilience. Margaret typed late into the night, occasionally pausing to listen to the peaceful sounds from Hollow Creek. The crying had stopped, but Elena's voice would continue to speak through the words Margaret wrote, through the scholarship her family had established, through the research station that would seek justice for other forgotten victims. Some voices, Margaret had learned, are simply too powerful to be silenced forever. They wait patiently in the darkness, carried on the wind and the water, until the right person comes along. Someone willing to listen, willing to believe, and willing to fight for truth, no matter how much time has passed. Elena Vasquez had waited 135 years for justice. But she had never stopped trying to tell her story, and she had never given up hope that someone would eventually hear her desperate pleas for help and decide to answer them. Margaret saved her work and closed the laptop, then walked once more to her bedroom window. The moonlight painted Hollow Creek silver, and the night was filled with the peaceful sounds of a story finally, completely told. "Rest well, Elena," she whispered into the Vermont darkness. "Your voice has been heard, your story has been told, and justice has finally come home." What moment in this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this narrative, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these stories coming.